The internet is a library of human experience, a place for connection, for laughter, for learning. But some pages, in some of the library's darkest corners, you'll wish you'd never opened. These are the stories that burrow under your skin, the ones that make you check the locks twice. They come from ordinary people who found themselves in moments that were anything but. Pulled directly from the threads of Reddit, these are the true stories that'll freak you out. So, turn down the lights and listen closely. Our first story comes from a user who we'll call Clara. At 22, she had just moved into her very first apartment. It was a small but exciting step into adulthood. The building was old with that charming but creaky character, and her third-floor unit looked out directly across a narrow street into the windows of the apartment building opposite. For the first few weeks, the apartment directly across from hers was vacant. The windows were dark and empty, a blank space in her view of the city. She got used to her privacy, often leaving her blinds open to let in the moonlight as she fell asleep. Then one evening, she noticed something new. In the center of the living room window opposite, a figure stood. It was a mannequin. A female one, bald and featureless, posed with one hand on its hip. Clara thought it was odd, but not alarming. Maybe an artist or a fashion student had moved in. She shrugged it off and went about her evening. The next day, the mannequin was still there, but something was different. Its head was tilted slightly to the side, as if curious. Clara stared at it for a long moment. She couldn't remember if it had been tilted the day before. "I'm probably just imagining things," she told herself. Still, a little prickle of unease made her close her blinds halfway. A few days passed. Life went on. She'd occasionally glance over and see the mannequin, always in that same slightly tilted pose. She was getting used to it. It was just a weird part of her view now. One Friday night, she came home late from a dinner with friends. As she unlocked her door, she felt that familiar, inexplicable urge to look. She flicked on her lamp and peered through her blinds. The apartment across the street was dark, but the mannequin was silhouetted by the streetlights below. And its arm had moved. Before, its hand had been on its hip. Now, its arm was bent at the elbow, its hand resting just below its neck in a pensive, thoughtful gesture. Clara's blood ran cold. There was no way she had imagined that. It was a deliberate, significant change in posture. Her mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. The new tenant was an artist. They were setting up a seam. They were just moving their mannequin around. It was weird, but it wasn't impossible. It wasn't threatening. Was it? That night, she closed her blinds completely, but she couldn't sleep. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every creak of her old building sounded like a footstep. She kept picturing the mannequin, standing in the darkness across the street. Its pose shifted. The next morning, with the sun shining and the fear of the night feeling distant and silly, she forced herself to look. She took a deep breath and opened the blinds. The mannequin was now facing her directly. Its head was no longer tilted. It was staring straight into her apartment, and both of its arms were down at its sides. Clara felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't random. This was a pattern. Each change was subtle, making her doubt her own sanity. But now there was no doubt. Someone was moving it. Someone who knew she was watching. For the entire weekend, she lived with her blinds shut, a prisoner in her own home. She felt watched, constantly. The sense of violation was overwhelming. On Monday, she decided she'd had enough. She was either going to go insane or do something about it. She worked up the courage to walk across the street and into the other building. She checked the mailboxes in the lobby. The apartment directly across from hers, number 3B, was listed as vacant. No name. Her fear returned tenfold. She went back to her apartment and called the building manager for the property across the street, her voice trembling. She explained the situation, trying to sound as rational as possible. The manager sounded confused. He assured her that apartment 3B was empty and had been for months. He said he would send the building's maintenance guy over to check it out, just in case. Clara waited by her window, peeking through a tiny slit in her blinds. An hour later, she saw a man with a tool belt unlock the door to 3B and go inside. He was in there for about 5 minutes. When he came out, he was on the phone. She saw him shake his head and shrug before locking the door and leaving. A few minutes later, her own phone rang. It was the building manager. "Ma'am," he said, "I had my guy check the whole unit. There's nothing in there. No furniture, no boxes, and definitely no mannequin. The place is empty. Dust on the floor. Hasn't been touched in a long time." Clara's heart stopped. She stammered, "No, that can't be right. I'm looking at it right now." She opened her blinds wide, her hands shaking, to prove to herself that she wasn't crazy. The window across the street was empty. The mannequin was gone. The room behind the window was bare, just as the manager had described. There was no sign anything or anyone had ever been there. Clara moved out a month later. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She never saw the mannequin again. But the question that haunts her to this day isn't about where the mannequin went. It's the one she can never answer. How long had someone been living in that dark, vacant apartment, watching her, before they decided to get a mannequin? And how long did they stand there, in the dark, pretending to be it? Story 2. Sometimes the freakiest things aren't threats you can see, but glitches in the world you thought you knew. This story comes from a user named Mark, and it took place during a long, cross-country drive. Mark was driving from Utah to Oregon, a trip he'd made a dozen times. To save money, he always drove through the night. He knew the route by heart, long, desolate stretches of highway through Nevada, where the world shrinks to the twin beams of your headlights and the lonely glow of the dashboard. It was around 2 a.m. He was deep in the desert, hundreds of miles from any major city. His phone had lost service hours ago. His playlist had gotten repetitive, so he decided to scan the radio for a bit of company. He turned the dial. Static. Static. A faint whisper of a Spanish station, then more static. This was normal for this part of the country. He was about to give up and go back to his phone when he landed on it. A signal, crystal clear. It was 97.3 FM. There was no music, just a voice. It was a man speaking in a completely flat, monotone voice. There was no emotion, no inflection. He just spoke. At first, Mark thought it was some kind of number station, those mysterious shortwave broadcasts used for espionage. The man's voice said, a few seconds of silence. 9, 0, 3. The nest is empty. Mark frowned. It was bizarre but captivating. He kept listening. The pattern continued, a string of numbers followed by a short, cryptic phrase. 2, 8, 5. The clock has no hands. 6, 1, 9. The shadow walks backwards. The phrases were nonsensical, like lines from a surrealist poem, but the delivery was so unnerving, so sterile. Mark tried to find another station, just to see if anything else was out there. He turned the dial, but no matter where he went, it was static. When he turned back to 97.3, the signal was still perfect, as if the transmitter was right beside his car. He listened for another 10 minutes, the strange litany of numbers and phrases becoming a hypnotic, unsettling soundtrack to the empty road. Then, something changed. The voice stopped the pattern. After a long silence, it spoke again, and the words made the hair on Mark's arms stand on end. The driver is tired. Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He glanced at the empty passenger seat, then into the rear-view mirror. Nothing but blackness. It had to be a coincidence, a ridiculously creepy coincidence. He tried to laugh it off, but then the voice came again. He is far from home.
Okay, that was less of a coincidence. Most people driving this road at this hour were, but the directness of it, it felt personal. Mark felt a cold sweat on his brow. The vast, empty desert suddenly felt claustrophobic, like the blackness was pressing in on his car. He reached to turn the radio off, but as his finger touched the button, the voice said, "He should not be listening."
Mark yanked his hand back as if he'd been burned. His heart was now pounding. This wasn't a broadcast. It couldn't be. It felt like the voice was right there in the car with him, watching him. He fumbled with the radio, jamming the power button. The radio went silent. The dashboard lights flickered. He let out a shaky breath, the silence a massive relief. He focused on the road, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He was just tired. His mind was playing tricks on him. And then the radio turned itself back on. The same flat voice filled the car, louder this time. "We see you." Mark screamed. It was a short, sharp cry of pure terror. He didn't even think. His foot slammed on the accelerator. The engine roared as the car shot forward, flying down the empty highway. He didn't know what he was running from, but he knew he had to get away. He glanced at his GPS. The screen was blank. The clock on his dashboard was flashing 12 over and over again. The voice on the radio changed. It was no longer monotone. It was distorted, angry. Mark was crying now, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He just kept driving, faster and faster, his eyes locked on the horizon, praying for the lights of a town. The voice shrieked numbers and broken phrases, a storm of electronic rage pouring from his speakers. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A faint glow. A town. As he got closer, the lights growing brighter, the voice on the radio began to break up, dissolving back into static. By the time he passed the "Welcome to Winnemucca" sign, his radio was silent. His GPS flickered back to life, showing his location perfectly. The clock on his dashboard read 3:17 a.m. Everything was normal. He pulled into the first gas station he saw, his body shaking uncontrollably. He sat there for nearly an hour, just breathing. In the years since, Mark has tried to find any record of 97.3 FM in that region of Nevada. He's searched online databases, old radio logs, forums for broadcast enthusiasts. The frequency is dead air. It doesn't exist. It never has. He doesn't drive at night anymore. And sometimes, when he's alone in his car, he swears he can hear, just for a second, a faint whisper of static. And he wonders, what exactly was watching him in the desert that night? Story 3. Our final story is about a job, a seemingly simple job with one very, very important rule. The user, who we'll call James, was a college student desperate for cash. He found a listing online that seemed too good to be true. Night caretaker for a historic downtown office building. The pay was great and the duties were minimal. Basically, he just had to be there. He got an interview with the building's owner, an old, eccentric man named Mr. Blackwood. The building itself was a relic, a beautiful but imposing stone structure that was mostly empty, save for a few law firms on the lower floors. The interview was strange. Mr. Blackwood didn't ask about his experience or qualifications. He just stared at James with intense, watery eyes and explained the job. "Your job is to sit at the front desk from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., he said, his voice raspy. You make sure no one comes in. You do a single patrol of the first 3 floors at midnight. That's it. You can read, study, whatever you want. But there is one rule. It is the most important rule of this job." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "This building has a west wing. It was damaged in a fire 60 years ago and has been sealed off ever since. The door is at the end of the 3rd floor hallway. You will hear things from that wing, noises, voices. You are to ignore them. Do not investigate. Do not open that door. Do not even acknowledge that you hear them. Do you understand me, son? Your only job is to ignore the west wing." James, thinking this was just the rambling of an old man or a weird test, agreed readily. Easy money. So what if the old building made some weird noises? The first week was a breeze. The silence of the vast, empty building was peaceful. He did his patrol at midnight, the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the marble hallways. He'd sit at the massive mahogany desk, do his homework, and watch the hours tick by. He never heard a thing from the 3rd floor. He started to think Mr. Blackwood was just crazy. It was on his 8th night that he first heard it. He was on his patrol, walking down the 3rd floor corridor. As he passed the end of the hall, where a heavy steel-bolted door marked the entrance to the west wing, he heard it. A faint tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was quiet, barely audible. He froze, remembering Mr. Blackwood's warning. His heart began to beat a little faster. It was probably just a pipe, or the building settling. He turned and walked away, a little quicker than he meant to. The next night, he heard it again, tapping. But this time it sounded rhythmic, like Morse code. He tried to ignore it, but the sound followed him all the way back down to the lobby. The noises began to escalate. A few nights later, the tapping was replaced by a scraping sound, like fingernails dragging slowly down a wooden door. James's peaceful nights were now filled with a creeping dread. He started bringing headphones, blasting music to drown out the sounds he knew were coming. But the sounds seemed to know. One night, during a quiet part of a song, he heard something new, something that the music couldn't block. It was the sound of a little girl, humming. It was faint, but it was unmistakably coming from behind the West Wing door. James ripped his headphones off, his blood turning to ice. The humming continued for a few seconds, then stopped. He sat at his desk, paralyzed with fear, until the sun came up. He thought about quitting, but the money was too good, and he told himself he was being irrational. He was a 20-year-old man, afraid of a noise in a hallway. The final straw came a week later. He was doing his patrol, dreading the third floor. As he approached the West Wing door, he heard a new sound. It was a woman crying, softly. The sound was so full of grief, so real, that James felt a pang of sympathy. Then, the crying was cut short by a loud, sudden crash, a sound like heavy furniture being thrown against a wall. James froze, and then a woman's voice, clear as day, screamed from behind the door. "Please, someone help me! He's going to—" Her voice was cut off abruptly. Silence. James stood there, his mind a whirlwind of terror and indecision. The rule. Mr. Blackwood's voice echoed in his head. Ignore the noises. Do not open that door. But that wasn't just a noise. That was a person, a woman in trouble. What if someone was trapped in there? What if the fire story was a lie? What if something horrible was happening, and he was the only one who could help? His morality warred with his fear. After a minute that felt like an eternity, he couldn't stand it anymore. He ran to the door and pulled on the handle. It was locked tight. He looked around frantically, spotted a fire extinguisher on the wall, and without a second thought, he used it to smash the lock. With a loud crack, the bolt gave way. He pushed the heavy door open. He was met with a wall of dust and the smell of stale, stagnant air. He fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight. He pointed the beam inside. The West Wing was a ruin, but not from a fire. It was just empty. Immense, cavernous rooms covered in thick white sheets. Everything was draped, silent and still under a blanket of dust that had to be decades old. There were no footprints, no signs of life, no signs of a struggle. Nothing. He stepped inside, his light cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" He called out, his voice shaking. "Is anyone here?" Only the echo of his own voice answered him. He was standing in the middle of the main room, confused and terrified, when his phone rang. The caller ID read, "Mr. Blackwood." James's stomach dropped. He answered, his hand trembling. "Hello?" Mr. Blackwood's raspy voice came through the speaker, but it wasn't angry. It was resigned, disappointed. "You opened the door, James." It wasn't a question. I heard a woman scream. I thought someone was hurt." There was a long sigh from the other end of the line. "Yes, the last caretaker heard that too. That's why he opened the door." James didn't understand. "What do you mean? There's nothing here." "Of course not," Mr. Blackwood said, his voice taking on a chillingly calm quality. "There is never anything there. But the job has to be done. The rule must be maintained. And now, we need a new noise." James felt a coldness spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. What do you mean?" Mr. Blackwood's voice was the last thing he heard before the line went dead. "It's your turn to make the sounds now, son." And from behind him, the heavy steel door to the West Wing slammed shut, plunging him into total darkness. The click of the bolt locking into place echoed in the vast, empty room. The user's post ended there. A story about a job he took one summer. There was never A follow-up.